This is the last sermon in our Lives of the Spirit series. Since September, we've been exploring some of the lives and teachings of some of the great spiritual activists of the 20th century. By probing their stories, we have hoped to offer you the opportunity to gain some clarity into your own. Each figure, in their own fashion, considered the nature of the good life. Each, as best they could, found answers to the questions: what is the good life? How do I know that I am living it? What models or exemplars might I follow as I seek to live into it? From the Jewish rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel to the Sioux organizer Mary Bravebird, all of the figures from our series have been part of one of the world's great religious traditions or philosophical traditions. Today we conclude closer to home with a focus on the prominent Unitarian Universalist Forrest Church. He distilled his answers to our questions into a concise mantra: want what you have, do what you can, be who you are. Before we explore church's theology further, I have two confessions. The first is about Church and his preaching, and the second is about his ministry. When I started in the ministry close to 2 decades ago, he was widely regarded as the preeminent living Unitarian Universalist preacher. People flocked to All Souls, New York, to hear him preach. Located on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, many of my colleagues treated a visit to the congregation he served almost as if it was a pilgrimage. He was interviewed by Terry Gross on NPR and frequently quoted in the New York Times. He was kind of a big deal. Shortly after graduating from seminary, I was called to serve a small urban congregation in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. 20 years ago, most seminary courses focused on theology, religious ethics, and history. I took about 30 classes during my time at Meadville Lombard Theological School. Only 2 of them dealt in any real way with preaching. So I arrived in Cleveland with maybe 20 sermons under my belt, completed an internship and a part-time contract ministry while waiting to see the Ministerial Fellowship Committee. At most, I'd had the opportunity to preach once a month. So now I was a sole minister of a small congregation without the resources to bring guests, and I was expected to fill the pulpit 3, maybe 4 times a month. It was a little daunting. What is more, to tell the truth, I'm neither an extrovert nor a natural public speaker. Only now, after having been a religious professional for most of my adult life, am I able to mostly quell my desire to vomit or run into the bathroom before the service starts on Sunday. And you can ask Scott about that, because the best sermon, I sometimes think, is the one already preached. And it is, as Carl Scoville, another famous Unitarian Universalist minister liked to say, each sermon better than the next. Church made almost all of his sermons dating back to 1995 available online, and as I tried to figure out how the heck I was going to approach preaching every week, I cast about for models. After some thought, I settled on the idea that I would study his sermons. So methodically, each week, as I prepared my own sermons, I would read one of his sermons a day, reading through every one of his Sunday morning texts I could find. I learned a lot. Church dealt out portions of his life slowly, always as illustrations and invitations for the listener to contemplate their own life, rather than as incidents of self-confession. Preaching might be therapeutic, but it is not therapy, at least for the preacher. The point, as his biographer Dan Cryer has observed, is to illuminate not the preacher's life, but the listener's. In one sermon, I discovered that Church had been similarly uncertain about his preaching at the start of his career. He arrived at All Souls fresh out of Harvard with a PhD in hand in the history of early Christianity. At the end of his first year, the board president kindly took him aside to talk about his performance. The president told Church that he was doing a great job as an administrator. People were very happy with his pastoral presence. But for the love of all that was holy, could he put a little more work into his sermons? Church was already working at least 20 hours a week on them. Taken aback, he realized he needed to connect more with his congregation, and he turned to another model Unitarian preacher, A. Powell Davies, for inspiration. From studying Davies, he developed an approach to the sermon that centered on practical, ethical, and psychological lessons for his congregation. In another sermon I read of his, I learned to address a pastoral issue I often face. It revolves around something many of you have experienced: religious trauma. Oftentimes, people would come to Forrest Church and share with him about why they were having a hard time joining All Souls. They liked the congregation, they would confess, but they did not believe in God. They had left the religion of their childhood because its conceptions of the divine were too constrictive, too confining to stir their spirit. In such situations, he asked people about the God that they did not believe in. After they had told him, sometimes at length, he would say something like, "Well, I don't believe in that God either." And then he would share what became one of his most well-known sayings. "God is not God's name," he would say. Referring to the highest power that we can imagine, God is our name for that which is greater than all and yet resides within each. For some, it is a petty, angry, tribal baron, visiting punishment on all who do not believe in him. But for others, the highest power is love, goodness, justice, or the spirit of life itself. Each of us projects our limited experience in letters as big as our minds can fashion. Many of us call that limited experience God. Over the years, I've found a similar approach to be helpful when talking with some of you about your own religious backgrounds. I've also found something akin to security in my experience of reading through more than a decade's worth of his sermons. Through them, I came to the understanding that preaching is a dialogue in which the minister attempts to respond to the needs of the congregation. Our Lives of the Spirit series came from the desire of many of you expressed for more spirituality. Such responses are imperfect. Some of you have said that you have not found this series nourishing. They are also unevenly received. Others have told us that they're the best thing the congregation has done in many years. But most of all, good preaching, authentic preaching, is about life together. It centers on our shared experience, you and I, of living in religious community. It revolves around how we collectively try, as best we can, to understand and pursue the good life and live together in covenant. The other thing I learned from reading about 300 of his sermons is that preaching is an uneven art. Some his texts were tender reflections on pastoral care and plumbed the depth of life and death. Other weeks, they were soaring exemplars of theological rhetoric. And sometimes they were just not any good. To take a baseball metaphor, Jose Altuve is not going to hit a home run every time. A lot of the times, he's going to strike out. The thing I realized is that you don't have to hit a home run every Sunday. It was, to continue with the metaphor, to know that whenever you come to bat, if you can at least get a single, at least advance the collective project a little bit further, you're probably doing okay. And that some days, you're gonna strike out. Because after all, if Forrest Church had a few really bad sermons, and a couple of them are really bad, then I can probably be excused with having a substandard one once in a while. So that's the first confession. The second one is more troubling. Because what I didn't know when I started to study Church's sermons was that in 1991, he had had an affair with a member of his congregation, the woman who later became his second wife. Now, I'm not sure how I did not know this. By the time I entered the ministry, it was somewhat widely known within Unitarian Universalist circles. It had erupted into a scandal that had almost torn All Souls apart and was covered in the national media. When it became public knowledge, the congregation had gone so far as to vote on whether or not they wanted to retain Church as their minister. The spokesman for those who thought he should go was quoted by the New York Times as saying, "Church's actions and words are degrading to the ministry and have clearly been destructive to congregational life." Even in 2007, when I started in Cleveland, 1991 was a long time ago. During the controversy, Forrest Church had been brought before the Ministerial Fellowship Committee, but I'm not sure why he had gotten off with what could loosely be described as a slap on the wrist. By the time I entered the ministry, his star, once dimmed by scandal, had risen again. Many of those who had called for his ouster had returned to the congregation. Now, that does not make his conduct excusable. When ministers violate the trust of their congregations, they do damage. Oftentimes, they leave permanent negative marks on the religious communities they serve. Their violations of trust can resurface the traumas that congregants have had in their own lives. They can make it difficult to feel like a congregation is a safe place to pursue the good life, and they can undermine trust in institutions and the leaders that serve them. Since Church had his affair, the Ministerial Fellowship Committee has become clearer both about the damage that clerical indiscretion causes and the consequences for a clergy who commit them. Many of you know this because 5 years ago, Daniel O'Connell, then the First Unitarian Universalist's former senior minister, resigned his fellowship pending an investigation for bullying the congregation's staff and creating a toxic workplace. Much of our work together over the last several years has been to repair the relationship between minister and staff and minister and congregation in the wake of that misconduct. I also know something about the damage that clergy misconduct causes on a personal level. 5 years ago, my best friend from seminary also resigned ministerial fellowship pending an investigation from the fellowship committee. Like Church, he had been the charismatic senior minister of a large congregation. Like Church, he had built a national profile that extended beyond our movement. Like Church, he had an affair with a member of the congregation, his congregation. But unlike Church, when the matter came to light, his colleagues, including myself, encouraged him to resign and leave the ministry. His violation of trust was devastating. I experienced his departure as something akin to a death. We've not spoken since, And yet, as with death, something of love remains. I often find myself reflecting upon positive aspects of our relationship. My friend had been a union organizer before entering seminary. And when we were there together, we often talked, and he gave me advice on his own approaches to community organizing that are lessons that I still carry with me today. After we graduated from Meadville, he brought me along with him on his rapid rise through the ministerial ranks. He was first called to serve a 400-member congregation when I was called to serve a 75-member one. When I returned to graduate school, he was called to serve a 1,000-member congregation. Because of our relationship, I got to know the ministers of large churches, many of whom I would have not met otherwise, and many of whom I still rely upon for advice in my own ministerial and professional life. One of the challenges that each of us faces is what to do about people who have done some bad things. My friend, Forrest Church, both did bad things. Perhaps the people who have done bad things in our lives are not our ministers. Maybe they're our parents or siblings or life partners. Maybe we are the people who have done some bad things. Whatever the case, I suspect that each of us has been confronted with trying to figure out how to relate to someone whose life is, to put it mildly, a mixed bag. So I'm not saying that it is right that Forrest Church remained in the ministry or that he became a well-regarded theologian. He did. That's just a fact. So instead of trying to lay blame on him one way or another, I think that we should acknowledge that when he died in 2008 at the age of 61 of esophageal cancer, he had become someone who had shaped the theology of the Unitarian Universalist tradition and shaped my own theology. His metaphor, the cathedral of the world, has become one of the ways in which many Unitarian Universalists talk about both individual experience and the world's religions. He spoke of one light, many windows. In one of his poetic meditations on the cathedral of the world, he wrote, "In the cathedral of the world there are windows beyond number, some long forgotten, covered with patinas of grime, others revered by millions, the most sacred of shrines. Each is in its own way beautiful. Some are abstract, others are representational, some dark and meditative, others bright and dazzling. Each window tells a story about the creation of the world, the meaning of history, the purpose of life, the nature of humankind, the mystery of death. The light that shines through the windows is the divine, or whatever you might choose to name ultimate reality. We each refract it through our own particular culture and experience. Church's metaphor of the cathedral of the world is a fundamentally mystic metaphor. It's mystic in the sense that we've been using mysticism throughout this sermon series. You might recall what Howard Thurman told us about the mystic. The mystic is one who discovers something within their own experience that opens up into the infinite. Church taught that within each of our own life experiences lies connection to the infinite. Part of the religious task is to be awakened, as he put it, to the beauty that surrounds us. Such a sentiment might seem familiar. I name it the resurrection of the living. I argue that one of the purposes of religious communion is to help us wake up to the world as it actually is. The beauty, the pain, the love, the fear, the disappointment, all of it. Here's what Church said about such resurrections. Awakening is life returning after a long journey and seeing the world, our loved ones, cherished possessions, and the tasks that are ours to perform with new eyes. When we undergo such an awakening, we become newly aware of the fleeting beauty and vulnerability of the world around us. We may only have today to tell someone that we love them. So why not awaken to this reality and center our relationships? Church shared his approach to the resurrection of the living in his mantra, want what you have, do what you can, be who you are. It is a fundamentally humanist mantra, does not point to an afterlife, does not rest on metaphysical claims. It simply enjoins us to accept the world, to awaken to it, and to accept ourselves. You are a living member of the great family of all souls, I might put it. You are filled with worth and dignity. You are worthy of love. And here, as we near the close, I invite you to do a thing in the spirit of that mantra. Want what you have, do what you can, be who you are. It's really a little thing you can do for someone else who is here today, because they might not hear it otherwise. I invite you to turn to your neighbor and say, you are filled with worth and dignity. You are worthy of love. You are a living member of the great family of all souls. Love, Church's theology would remind us, lays at the center of our lives, and we are people of worth and dignity. He helped bring that message into Unitarian Universalism. Of course, there are things about him beyond just his affair that I might criticize. The want what you have portion of his mantra seems best adjusted for those like Forrest Church who come from a life of privilege. He was the son of Senator Frank Church, his father one of the most consequential liberal political figures of the 20th century. He went to the best schools, Stanford and Harvard. He lived in a 3-story walk-up in Manhattan. His second wife, Carolyn Luce, was a wealthy heiress. He never really wanted for anything. So it was easy for him to advise people to want what you have. His was not a theology of liberation for the working classes, the undocumented migrants, or those who struggle to make ends meet each and every day. But such flaws are perhaps why he is a fitting figure to close our Lives of the Spirit series. Abraham Joshua Heschel, Dorothy Day, Grace Lee Boggs, or Swami Vivekananda, like them, Forrest Church was just a human being. So are we all. Each of the great spiritual activists whose lives we have studied was imperfect, just as each of my sermons about them has been an imperfect sermon. The ultimate query we should ask each of them is not whether or not they were perfect, but whether or not there is something from their teachings that might help us in our own quests for the good life. Unitarian Universalism, after all, offers no final answers. Religion, Forrest Church wrote, is our human response to the dual reality of being alive and having to die. Part of the response is to embark on the search, as we all do, willingly or not, for the good life. We do so that our lives might have some meaning along the way. The purpose of life is to live in such a way that our lives will prove dying for. What is such a life for you will necessarily be different than what it will be for me. If Forrest Church were to end this sermon, he might say something like, final answers to ultimate questions lie far beyond human understanding. We keep asking. It's the nature of our being. We keep climbing up to reach the stars, even as God comes down to share our tears. The mystery is by reaching for God, for a divine hand that may or may not be there, we can in fact be changed, even saved. And so that is my hope as we close this sermon series, that our time together, our journey, has helped you a little reach for the celestial spheres and kindle your own flame. In the hopes that my words have over these months been something of a blessing and brought a little life to your spirits, I invite the congregation to say, Amen.